Welcome, Brooke.
Thank you so much, Moa. And thanks to Simon for inviting me and all of you for being here today. I'm really thrilled to be able to join you, even if it is in these tiny little boxes. Maybe post-pandemic, we can find a way to visit in person. So can you give me a little thumbs up if you see the slides? Yep. Okay, great. That's good news. So as Moa mentioned, I've recently co-authored a book with Sarah Jackson and Moya Bailey called #Activism, Networks of Race and Gender Justice. If you have a physical copy, that's delightful. But if you don't, you can also get a digital copy for free through MIT Press Direct. I'll post that link at the end of the talk. Now, the book really explores online activism, particularly these kinds of networks of communication on Twitter that inform social justice movements around the world. So just a few examples to get you thinking in this space. I'm sure you have heard of these kinds of #activism movements. So the Umbrella Revolution in Hong Kong, the Arab Spring in the early 2010s, and of course the Black Lives Matter and Me Too movements, which started in the US, but have since sort of touched every part of the world. Now, it's hard to imagine, this is just a small assortment of hashtags that have inspired movements or come to symbolize movements. And it's hard to imagine a place in the world that hasn't been touched by one of these hashtags. Now, some people argue that this is a kind of disengaged activism. I've heard some folks call it slacktivism, but the research that we do in the book really tries to change that narrative and demonstrate how #activism is just a natural progression of media-based activism. Specifically, it sits alongside other forms of media-based activism, which have existed at least since the 1700s, when Enlightenment era philosophers such as John Locke used their new media technology at the time, namely the printed book, to circulate then radical ideas such as questioning religious authority. So our work suggests that hashtags and online communication have similarly become this organizing thread that stitched together regular people into vast networks that are capable of influencing mainstream media and by proxy influencing public opinion. And the specific way that we study these hashtags is not as individual pieces of narrative or discourse, but as networks. So my role in the project team is a network scientist. I harness data, capture it, and then transform it into networks like these. So what you're seeing here is 3 different hashtag networks. In these particular networks, which are all drawn from Twitter data, the nodes in the networks are individual accounts, and the links are forms of communication, specifically retweets and mentions, although obviously Twitter has implemented more ways to engage as time moved on. So now we have things like quote retweets and so on. I'm going to start off with just a case study. So this was the first one of these hashtags that we studied. And I think it really helps us get into the space and unpack some of the theory that we use to underlie the arguments in the book. So this particular case study, I'm guessing many of you have not heard of. Even folks in the US have not generally heard of this one, or they don't remember it. So I'll give you a bit of context. I know that many of you are probably familiar with the policing system in the United States, but some bits of it I think are pretty unbelievable to an international audience. So we'll level set your expectations here. So this case study is #MyNYPD. It happened in April of 2014. As a kind of historical background, just a little more than a year prior, or a little less than a year prior, in August of 2013, the New York City Police Department was sued, and the Southern District Court ruled that their stop and frisk policy was unconstitutional on the grounds that it disproportionately targeted Black and Brown citizens for searches without reasonable suspicion of a crime. So in court testimony, in this case, officers freely admitted that they were pressured to meet certain stop and frisk targets per month, and that this policy almost certainly increased their likelihood of interacting, sometimes violently, with Black citizens in the city of New York. So a year after that, so after my NYPD, Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri. I will unpack that case study in more detail later on, but this was really the case of that catalyzed Black Lives Matter. Although the hashtag had existed prior to August 2014, this is the time when it got mainstream, widespread news coverage. So this is where the conversation about race and policing in the United States really changed. And these counter narratives coming out of the Black community about the police not always being this benevolent force for good really took hold. So my NYPD takes place right in between these two events. So there's some awareness that there might be racist or discriminatory policing happening, especially in New York City. But this isn't yet a widespread mainstream conversation, and certainly not a conversation happening amongst white folks in parts of the United States. So keeping that in mind, in April of 2014, the New York City Police Department posted this tweet, and it says, "Do you have a photo with a member of the NYPD, New York City Police Department? Tweet us and tag it, #MyNYPD. It may be featured on our Facebook." So they did not get the kinds of photos that they were hoping for. They did, to be fair, get a few photos like this. There are a few photos of police as first responders to the 9/11 terrorist attacks, police at sporting events. Police horses were particularly popular early on. But what they got was an overwhelming majority of photos of police violence. So specifically photos like these illustrating violent and aggressive police tactics, police sort of disproportionately targeting and profiling Black citizens, and generally being violent in response to sort of constitutional and regular things like our constitutional right to protest. In total, over 100,000 tweets were posted in 2 days using the hashtag #MyNYPD. And the vast, vast, vast majority of them portray police violence and other kinds of critiques of policing. So sorry about that. Sarah and I, when we were working together, saw this trending on Twitter, and we were super interested in how this was happening. So at the time, this was a very different narrative about policing than we might expect. At the same time, it is not an uncommon way for activists to do their work. So we call this a form of culture jamming. So when folks kind of take a narrative that exists in the public and deliberately subvert that narrative to tell us a different kind of story. So we were really interested, being a network scientist, in exactly how this happened. So who is it that was doing the culture jamming that ultimately changed the mainstream narrative about policing? At the time, the kind of state of the art in network science was all pointing in the same direction, that said, although there's this kind of democratic ideal on the internet, in reality, on places like Twitter, it's still effectively a broadcast mechanism. So functionally, for something to trend, all of these papers and the kind of prevailing wisdom was that you need a celebrity or a mainstream news outlet, maybe a national politician, to get involved. And they are the ones that ultimately amplify the messages into the mainstream. So that's not so different than a kind of traditional elite gatekeeping function. So news media, celebrities, and politicians in any kind of media do this gatekeeping and spread messages. So when I made this network, I gathered the tweets, I took the accounts and connected them by retweets, and looked at who the most influential accounts are in the network. And what I saw was this. It was especially surprising to me to not see celebrities, to not see mainstream politicians, and not see mainstream news outlets in the middle of this network. So the folks that are sort of highlighted in a color and named on this particular network are the 12 most popular accounts. For those who work with network data, you know that often we get long tail distributions of engagement, and the folks way out in the long tail get a disproportionate number of retweets in this case. So these are really the folks who are capturing audience in this network and are driving the conversation. And if these don't look familiar to you, that wouldn't be so surprising to me. So you might recognize Occupy Wall Street or Occupy Bay Street. These are accounts associated with the Occupy movement that happened a couple of years prior. They are popular, but not as popular as you might think. So about they had about 120,000 followers combined. So at the time that this particular hashtag trended. So, that's reasonably popular, but certainly not Katy Perry celebrity status, right? The rest of these folks, we see some independent news outlets, and then several just regular folks. So Maureen, again, is an activist. It's actually Jeannie Lauren who wrote the foreword to our book. Molly Crabapple is a journalist, but she had just started working as a journalist at the time, so she did not have any considerable following or influence. And then some of these other accounts are just the Kamani film is just the family of a boy who was killed in crossfire by the New York City police that were trying to get attention. They had 42 followers at the time that this particular thing trended. So this really was a puzzle, right? So here we see a case where an engaged set of activists and regular citizens were able to trend a hashtag and gain widespread media attention without the involvement of celebrities or other mainstream elites. We were puzzling over this for a while when the then, at the time, New York City Police Commissioner Bill Bratton put out this news conference, and he had this quote amongst his comments about the MyNYPD hashtag. He said, quote, "Most of the pictures I've looked at, they're old news. They've been out there for a long time." And this is exactly the point. So this is what really solidified our thinking about hashtag activism, that of course the pictures have been out there for a long time. It's not as if the MyNYPD hashtag emerged and then suddenly people had these violent alterations with the police. They had already had them. They already had these photos on their phones, and they were seeking news coverage. But any individual incident on its own was not newsworthy. So people were unable to get the attention and the justice that they wanted individually, but they were able to come together and stitch together this network around the hashtag, and the collection of the tweets and the collection of the experiences together are what became the newsworthy story. And in fact, we did see widespread news coverage. So most major mainstream news outlets covered the MyNYPD hashtag. To be fair, most of them covered it as a kind of public relations snafu, so they weren't covering the alternate narrative about policing quite yet. But nevertheless, they did include, several of them included photos that appeared in the tweets. So suddenly these tweets or these particular images that couldn't get widespread attention were receiving widespread national news coverage. And some outlets, especially the ones that tend to be a bit more progressive, did cover the actual incident and the kind of underlying narrative around MyNYPD. So this is Ari Melber sitting in for Lawrence O'Donnell on Last Word that night. They did about a 3-minute segment that included the following quote that I'm just going to read to you because it's so lovely. So he says, quote, "Anyone who follows politics today knows about the simplistic and often false choice of whether we should be agitating on the internet or on the streets. But here's the thing about most of the photos. They were all taken in the streets. They all happened in the streets, and yet many of them didn't initially achieve any great impact, let alone response from the city or the press, until they found traction through the online publishing platforms." End quote. So the premise of the MyNYPD paper and the kind of impetus for the rest of the book is that by coming together under the auspices of these hashtags, folks are able to create a broadcast mechanism. So organically and working together, they're able to harness the kind of power that's typically restricted to folks that are in mainstream elite positions, and instead work together to create these alternate narratives that then get pushed into the mainstream. So to wrap a kind of theoretical lens about that, the basis of our work is in public sphere theory. I'm sure many of you have heard of this, but briefly, public sphere theory sort of argues that in an idealized democracy, people will gather in public spaces, discuss the terms of the day, come to some resolution about what ought to happen, and then pass that on to elected leaders in order to enact those policies. Very quickly on the heels of Habermas sort of coining this idea, Black and feminist scholars came along and pointed out rightly that not all kinds of people are included in these kinds of public conversations. So certain types of people, namely women, people of color, people with disabilities, LGBTQ people, and so on, aren't often invited into public spaces to deliberate and debate the terms of the day. This doesn't mean that they're utterly disenfranchised, right? So instead, folks who are marginalized gather in counter-public spheres and gather with people who sort of have like-minded policy ideas and have similar experiences. They support one another and then try to infiltrate that mainstream public sphere through things like culture jamming, activism, hijacking, and so on. Okay. Fast forward a couple of decades, and we know that people aren't often gathering in coffee houses or town halls anymore. They gather online, especially in this last year, but even before this last year. So Benkler and others coined this idea of networked publics to kind of capture this sense that we don't always meet face-to-face to debate the terms of the day. Instead, we meet online. And, ideally, our elected officials are in those spaces as well, and they're responding to public sentiment based on what's happening online. I'm guessing that you could probably imagine the theoretical intervention that Sarah and I made, if you like symmetry. Our idea was networked counterpublics. So just like coffee houses and town halls and those sorts of spaces aren't always welcoming or inclusive of everyone, we also see that the kind of mainstream places on the internet, for a variety of technical and social reasons, are also not welcoming and inclusive of everyone. And yet, people who are outside the mainstream, marginalized folks, find ways to gather and infiltrate those mainstream conversations. So those folks gather in networked counterpublics, form opinions about what matters, and then attempt to take over the mainstream conversation, as we saw with Maya NYPD. So with that kind of theoretical premise in mind, the book works through a number of different case studies, and I wanted to share one with you that really illustrates how this mainstream reframing in the mainstream media works. So this one is the case of #Ferguson, and this is a story of amplification. So we find, pretty tragically, about 1,000 people are shot by police officers per year in the United States. So it is fairly remarkable when one gets attention. So we don't tend to have widespread news coverage of police officers killing American citizens. I know, it's shocking, but it is the way it is. And yet we find occasionally, including the case of Michael Brown's death at the hands of a police officer named Darren Wilson in Ferguson, Missouri, occasionally these stories do get widespread mainstream news coverage. So this particular paper really asks, how did that happen? So what was the process that amplified Michael Brown's story, and how did the particulars of his amplification or his story's amplification influence the mainstream news coverage? So our default expectation is that these stories would not get covered at all, and if they do, that they'd be extremely favorable to the police. So journalists tend to rely on police as credible news sources, and they don't often engage local community members, which will invariably show up in how these cases are reported. So for this particular paper, I gathered all the network data. We had over 500,000 tweets in just a 10% random sample. So this was an enormous spike in Twitter activity over the week following Michael Brown's death. So he was killed on August 9th, and I gathered data through the 15th. The aggregate network has over 300,000 nodes with 425,000 links. That's sort of impossible to analyze it, especially in the way that Sarah and Moya and I work together, where we do network and discourse analysis. So instead of analyzing it in aggregate, I divided it into daily networks, which varied in size from on August 9th, just a little under 5,000 nodes, to the biggest one on August 14th, when the protests and news coverage really intensified, to almost 200,000 nodes, right? So I have a different network for every day. And from that, I pulled out the people who are most popular. So this corresponds, there's a nice coincidence of theory and method here. So Zizi Papakurisi coined this idea of crowdsourced elites. So her idea was that on a place like Twitter, we don't have elites in the traditional sense. I mean, we do on some level, right? So there are, of course, celebrities and so on Twitter, but they're not involved in every conversation. And nevertheless, it's not pandemonium, right? So conversations still tend to center on a small number of voices. And those voices are kind of amplified and upvoted by other people in the networks. So you and I, when we engage with different tweets, we create this crowdsourcing effect. So we choose our elites through our communication and interaction. This happens to fall very nicely onto a property of networks. So absent any context, we know that most networks follow this power law degree distribution, where most of the nodes don't receive very much attention at all, and a very small number of nodes way out here on the end of this tail will receive almost all the attention. So typically, in these Twitter networks, I'll see a very small handful of nodes, maybe 10 or 12, that receive a third of all the attention in the network. And so this aligns so beautifully. So we have this sleight of hand. We don't have to look at the whole network. So we really don't need to look at what's going on down here because no one's really seeing this. If we want to know what's happening in these networks and what people are talking about, we can really focus our energy way out here, because these are simultaneously the kind of theoretically crowdsourced elites. This is what the audience of onlookers decided was important. And also mathematically, the people who are capturing most of the attention in the network. So that was a really lucky coincidence. So focusing in on those, the thing I'm going to show you is the changing of the crowdsourced elites. So I'm going to show you who the most popular people were on each day throughout that week and what they were saying. So beginning on August 9th, this is the day Michael Brown is killed, and we see his neighbors gathering and posting photos of what happens. So this is the first tweet that we could find, and we think the first tweet about Michael Brown's death. And it says, Ferguson police just executed an unarmed 17-year-old boy that was walking to the store, shot him 10 times, SMH. So we've actually spoken with this woman. She's a neighbor, and she was taking photos from her porch. So Michael Brown's body is just beyond her porch where the crowd has gathered. So this is really the first day. Community members outraged by what happened and trying to get, express their grief in public. At this point, they're not even necessarily trying to get attention. By August 10th, there was a small sort of protest happening. People were asking for answers. They wanted to know the name of the police officer involved. And some local celebrities got involved. And by local celebrities, I mean people who are, mildly famous in this area, but not famous outside of the area. So Tef Poe is a hip hop artist. He has a medium following for a local person on account of, having been a DJ and a popular sort of performer at local events, but he is not recognizable as a mainstream artist. And he starts to amplify the messages from his community. So he starts to try to, and specifically in some cases, asks for attention to be paid to what's happening. By August 11th, the protests are gaining some steam, and we start to see emergent activists. So these are folks who, engage in more organizing efforts. And in this particular case, the example that I chose here is Netta. Her name is Jonetta Elzie, and she's since become quite famous as one of the key Black Lives Matter activists. So she now goes around the country and kind of catalyzes protests when they're needed. By August 12th, we start to see some engagement from local politicians. And local politicians dance an interesting line in this kind of elite space. So on some level, they are elite, right? So they've been elected, they have positions of power, but at the same time, they're still community members. So when they report on events in their communities, they tend to be more sympathetic to community members than outside politicians or outside reporters are. So you'll see some echoes of, the kinds of messages coming out from the protesters, the regional celebrities, and so on when they talk. So here we see, Antonio French, a local city councilor, who's kind of pushing back against some of the police tactics to corral the protesters. By August 13th, mainstream journalists start to get involved. At first, it was regional journalists and then national news journalists. At this point, the protests are really getting quite amplified and quite big. The police are responding violently to the protests, and that coverage showed up in the news coverage that came out. Ultimately, by the 14th, we see widespread mainstream news stories. So every newspaper in America had a front page story about Michael Brown and Ferguson on August 14th. And I think the really interesting thing, in addition to the fact of this happening, which is not expected, is the particular nature of the coverage. So I don't have a counterfactual world where I can show you what the coverage would have looked like if it had existed without this narrative weaving through. But what I can point you to is some of the word choices that happen that seem to bear some resemblance to the way that community members and activists are talking about Michael Brown. And in particular, I'm going to point your attention back to that very first tweet. And we see that this woman from Michael Brown's neighborhood uses the terms executed and 17-year-old boy. And these are both important terms. So often when we report on incidents involving the police in the United States, we use very passive language. So we say something like police involved shooting, right? Which really doesn't convey the horror of what happened, nor the active role of the police officer in killing a citizen. So she uses the word executed, which of course is much more vivid and active. She also really emphasized Michael Brown's youth. So in the United States, and I think elsewhere in the world, we tend to emphasize how scary Black teenagers are or how big they are. You'll often hear police officers saying, I thought he was older than he was, right? So we age up Black young people in order to make these kinds of killings seem more justified. So fast forward to August 14th, where we get that news coverage, and we see some pretty active and similar wording. So we see killing. It's not execution. I don't know that we could expect the New York Times to publish the word execution, but we see killing. We don't see police involved shooting or some other euphemism. And we also see teenager in that headline. So we don't see young man or person, right? So we see teenager, really emphasizing Michael Brown's youth. So we argue that it's ultimately this media influence that influences the mainstream conversation. So Twitter is the mechanism to create the alternate narratives, and the media become the proxy that then get it out to the widespread community. And since then, of course, in the United States, pretty rapidly, we've seen a transformative change in how we talk about policing, with many communities doing police reforms and requiring different tactics from their police officers. There was a report that came out recently about how communities with protest have significantly fewer officer-involved shootings, if you will. And we also see mainstream changes. So many institutions creating diversity and inclusion policies. It's not perfect. The work isn't done, but we have seen some pretty radical and transformative changes in just 5 or 6 years. Okay, so I'm going to button up that case study and move on to just one last one that highlights a different kind of mechanism that happens in networks. In this case study, I'm guessing you know this one as well. So this is really a case study of the Me Too movement. And here we were really interested in why people started disclosing things through Me Too. So we know that social media has been instrumental for letting people anonymously disclose things on the internet. So there have been a number of papers about, how people use message boards and forums under pseudonyms to disclose things like pregnancy loss and rape and sexual assault and so on. And under the veil of anonymity, the idea is that stigma goes down, and so we're more willing to kind of disclose things. But that's not exactly what happened with Me Too. So Me Too was largely not anonymous. People were disclosing their experiences of sexual assault and harassment on Twitter and Facebook, often with their actual names. So this movement really started many years prior to when it took off with Tarana Burke, but then in 2017, Alyssa Milano, who's an American actress, posted this tweet that said, "If you've been sexually harassed or assaulted, write Me Too," as a reply to this tweet. In just 48 hours, Me Too was used over 12 million times on Facebook. It was used over 1 million times on Twitter. And in surveys, 45% of Facebook users said they had a friend disclose Me Too. This isn't probably representing the enormity of the challenge. So in some surveys, up to 90% of women claim having experienced some sort of assault or harassment. So 45% is not 90%. And yet we're starting to get a sense of the magnitude of the problem. And what's really remarkable here is that people are disclosing using their names. Typically, when people experience sexual assault, they don't tell anyone. And if they do tell people, they tell one close friend or family member. This really, cuts off the opportunity to get social support, and also really downplays the enormity of the challenge. So Me Too and the disclosures that came from it are really quite remarkable in terms of both catalyzing social change by having people recognize the problem, and also potentially allowing individuals to receive social support so that they can recover. So we were really interested in why this happened. So why is it that suddenly, all of a sudden, all these women are disclosing their stories? And the theory that we worked with to kind of explain what was happening here was a network level reciprocal self-disclosure. So I think that we're all familiar with self-disclosure as kind of relational tool. So we've all done this probably. As you're getting to know someone, you tell them something about yourself, and then they tell you something, and so on and so forth. And interpersonally, self-disclosure works in order to sort of build intimacy and closeness in relationships. When we do that in a network, the process is similar, but the implication is a little bit different. So we're going to track the kind of disclosure of this red node. So imagine the red node in the network has said something. They've made a disclosure. And what they're doing here is disclosing to their network that something has happened to them. So someone else in their network potentially feels a little bit of a reduced stigma. So they feel a little bit more likely to be able to disclose themselves. But they don't disclose back to that person, or at least not only to that person, they disclose in turn to their whole network. Right. So the process is up leveled from this kind of binary back and forth disclosure to this network wide disclosure. So the reciprocity is not individual between two people, it is generalized. And so we might expect then the next disclosure not to happen from the person who did the original disclosure, but from someone else in the network, and maybe especially someone who's following along and watching both disclosures. So in order to investigate this, we had to use a few different methods. We were lucky to have a corpus of Me Too tweets for the first 2 weeks after that Alyssa Milano tweet. And we took those tweets and did a qualitative content analysis of 2,500 of those tweets to figure out what disclosures look like. And then we used that content analysis and the terms that we drew out in order to automatically classify about 450,000 tweets that had Me Too in them. And then we did a quantitative network analysis on the disclosure patterns that kind of rippled through those networks. So we didn't look at 450,000 tweets. We used the classifier to classify them for us, and then ultimately use that to draw our conclusions. So just digging in a little bit more of the 2,500 tweets, they broke down almost evenly into disclosures and non-disclosures. I'm not going to talk too much about the non-disclosures, but they included things like, people talking about how pervasive sexual assault is, sort of sharing statistics, a little bit of pushback, but not much, to be honest. I'm going to focus today on the disclosures, and there is a limit and a little methodological trick that we used again in this paper. So the reality is, I don't know the people on Twitter. I don't know who has experienced sexual assault. We can make some guesses based on sort of prevalence in the population, but we don't know who could have disclosed Me Too but didn't. So instead, what we do is we compare the type of disclosure. Excuse me. And we look at descriptive and non-descriptive disclosures. So non-descriptive disclosure is just the hashtag #MeToo with nothing else attached to it, where a descriptive disclosure gives some kinds of details. So maybe a personal narrative or talking about incidents in more detail. And we suppose that these descriptive disclosures are maybe potentially a little bit more stigmatizing than just Me Too alone, although both are a certain kind of risk. So as examples, these are somewhat altered tweets to protect people's privacy, but we see, on this side, this would be our non-descriptive disclosure, and here's some examples of our descriptive disclosure. So we take these trainer classifier and then look for this kind of network level reciprocal self-disclosure. So just to unpack that, we're going to focus on this white node in the center, and we take that focal node and we look at who they're following. So these are the people that potentially could have disclosed and that this white node, the focal node, could have seen disclose. So again, another limitation that we don't actually know what people's eyeballs see on Twitter, although we know that there's the potential to see things that your followers are posting. And we then go and count amongst those followers how many people made descriptive disclosures, illustrated here in the teal, and how many people made non-descriptive disclosures. And then we calculate the probability based on what you could have seen of you making a descriptive or non-descriptive disclosure and draw some conclusions from that. So we hear, in this case, we see a descriptive disclosure. Okay, so if we count the number of potential exposures someone had prior to their own disclosure and measure that probability, if network level reciprocal self-disclosures are reducing stigma, then we'd expect someone to be more likely to disclose the more disclosures they see in their network, the more disclosures of any type. And specifically, we would expect them to make more descriptive disclosures as they see more disclosures in their network. And that is, in fact, what we see here. So this curve shows, especially early on, as you go from 0 to about 20 disclosures, your chance of making a disclosure goes up pretty substantially. There are diminishing returns here. So we might expect the folks out here, seeing 50 or 60 or 70 disclosures, just like don't have anything to say, or maybe feel so shy about it that they will never say it. So, if you've seen 60 disclosures, your 61st is not very likely to change your mind about disclosing. But to further explore this, we would also suppose that your probability of making a descriptive disclosure is related to your frequency of seeing these descriptive disclosures. So if you've seen many descriptive disclosures, maybe you'll make one that's descriptive, or if you mostly see non-descriptive ones, maybe you make one that's not so descriptive. And that's also exactly what we see. So the kind of warmer colors are higher probabilities. And we see up here, and the people who have seen mostly descriptive disclosures tend to have a high probability of making a descriptive disclosure themselves, where people who mostly see the non-descriptive disclosures, we see the cooler colors down here on this axis. So it's not that they don't make disclosures, but they're less likely to make descriptive ones. So we can conclude then that potentially there is this reduction in stigma that happens when we see people in our networks disclosing things that we ourselves are more likely to disclose, and we're more likely to kind of copy the style of disclosure that other people in our networks are making. So that brings us to our close. I think we're nearly to our Q&A time. So I want to leave you with 3 takeaways. So hopefully you're persuaded now that hashtag activism can be an effective tool for marginalized and stigmatized communities to create social change and draw attention to the issues that they care about. Hopefully you're persuaded that this works through networked processes, including network counterpublics, networked amplification, and reciprocal self-disclosure. And these processes, such as culture jamming, amplification, stigma reduction, and so on, allow hashtag activism to influence mainstream media, which ultimately influences our collective conversations. So we suppose that online activism is a proxy for influencing media, which ultimately will create social change. So with that, I would also like to invite you to keep tweeting. So, I focus a lot on the key messages and the kind of amplification mechanisms in my work, but these things are only possible through our active engagement. So if there's an issue you care about or something that you think ought to be talked about differently, it's important that you engage with that issue in these public spaces, because that will serve to maybe encourage reciprocal disclosures. It will serve to amplify or push up certain kinds of issues and draw enough attention to it that collectively it kind of becomes the broadcast mechanism into mainstream media. So as promised, here is the book. I can also, during the Q&A, drop that link into the slides. But if you just search MIT Press Direct, #activism, it ought to come up. And to close, here are my incredible co-authors, 3 faculty co-authors, Sarah, Maya, and Andrea. And Ryan and Lily are student co-authors, both of whom are going to be on the job market next year. So lucky you if you snag one of them. All right, that's it for me. I look forward to the Q&A.